Krakow is consumed by fire, devouring streets that have stood for centuries. Flames lick up wooden walls, destroying everything in their path. The screams of the dying mingle with the thunder of hooves, and above it all echoes a sound that will haunt Europe for generations. The war cries of Mongol riders, sweeping through the heart of Poland like a scythe through wheat. Bodies lie scattered in the streets. Some still clutch weapons they never got to wield. Poland's greatest city, abandoned in panic by its own people, falls without a fight. And this is only the beginning. But this story is different from any other tale of Mongol conquest you've ever heard. This is not a narrative of inevitable defeat. This is not another chronicle of invincible armies crushing all in their path. What happened in Poland was rare anywhere else in the world. Twice the Mongols came. Twice Poland fell to its knees. But the third time, that's where things change. Imagine you stand on the walls of Kaunas in December 1287, 46 years after that first nightmare, and you watch a new Mongol army approach. You've heard your grandfather's tales? You know what these warriors did to your city, to your people, to every kingdom that dared oppose them. And yet, this time, something has changed. This time, the walls beneath your feet are not made of wood. This time, Poland has learned. This time, Poland is ready. The question, echoing through history, is simple. What changed? How did a fractured, disunited kingdom transform into the force that could achieve what the mighty kingdoms of Hungary, Rus', and countless others could not? How did Poland become the anvil that finally broke the Mongol hammer? To understand this victory, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to appreciate just how terrifying the enemy truly was, and how complete Poland's defeat was. Because the transformation from victim to victor is one of the most astonishing stories of medieval warfare. And it begins with utter catastrophe. The 10th century Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, from the rice paddies of Vietnam to the frozen forests of Rus, from the deserts of the Middle East to the steppes of Central Asia. One people conquered more territory than the Romans could have ever dreamed, and they did it in less than a generation. This was no mere raiding party. This was a military machine so sophisticated, so utterly ruthless and effective, that contemporary Europeans literally believed they were God's punishment. They called them the horsemen of the apocalypse, and for good reason. Poland, by contrast, was chaos, divided into warring principalities, ruled by feuding dukes who could barely agree on anything, and situated right on the doorstep of Western Europe. If you were designing a victim for Mongol conquest, you could not have come up with anything better than 11th century Poland, fragmented, vulnerable, and directly in the path of armies that had just annihilated the Rus principalities. The Mongols were moving west, and Poland simply happened to be in their way. But before we delve into that first catastrophic encounter, I want you to understand something important about the Mongols. They were not barbaric hordes. That is a mistake Europeans made then, and it's a mistake far too many people make now. The Mongol army was the most advanced military force of its era, perhaps of any era before the modern age. They possessed intelligence networks that modern special forces would envy. They had communication systems utilizing riders and signal fires, capable of relaying messages across thousands of miles. They had tactical flexibility that would shame European knights, trained to attack in a straight line. And they had Subutai. If you don't know that name, you should. Subutai was perhaps the greatest general in human history, a general who won more battles, over a wider territory, against a more diverse range of enemies than anyone before or since. He conquered northern China, he defeated the armies of Rus', and in 1241, he planned an invasion of Europe with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The invasion plan was elegant in its simplicity. 3 armies would strike Europe simultaneously. The main force, under Batu Khan, with Subutai as the strategic genius, would attack Hungary. This was the primary objective, the richest kingdom in the heart of Europe. But Subutai knew that Hungary's King Bela IV had potential allies. Bohemia to the north, Poland to the northeast. Either of them could send troops to aid Hungary, and that could complicate matters. So, before delivering the main blow, these potential allies needed to be neutralized. Poland's role in this grand strategy was simple. It served as a distraction. A small contingent of Mongol cavalry, numbering 10,000 to 12,000 riders under the command of Princes Baidar and Kadin, was to sweep through Poland like a wildfire. Their goal was not conquest for the sake of dominion. Their goal was not to establish an occupying regime. Their mission was destruction. To burn cities to the ground, to scatter enemy forces, to sow panic, and most importantly, to ensure that no Polish army could march south to aid the Hungarians. This was a secondary task, a mere footnote to the main campaign. For Poland, however, it meant the very end of the world. The invasion began in the winter of 1240, and it was characterized by a speed that the Poles simply could not comprehend. European armies moved slowly, burdened by supply wagons and the logistical difficulties of feudal levies. The Mongols, however, moved with lightning speed. Their horses covered in days what took European armies weeks. They lived off the land. Each warrior carried dried meat and mare's milk, requiring no supply trains to slow their advance, and their intelligence network, built on captured prisoners and local informants, allowed them to know the precise location of every Polish detachment before the Poles themselves could even comprehend their own position. The first to fall was the city of Sudeck. The Mongols descended upon it like a hammer, and when they were done, almost nothing remained for it to recover. The city simply ceased to exist. It was so thoroughly erased from the map that historians are still unsure of its exact location. Then came Lublin, a prosperous trading hub. It too fell. Sandomierz, a major fortress that should have held for weeks, surrendered on February 13th after a brief assault. The Mongols plundered it anyway, as this was the message they wanted to send. Surrender or resist, the outcome would be the same. Terror was their weapon, and they wielded it with masterful precision. This is where Poland's fragmentation proved fatal. Polish forces, had they united, might have outnumbered the Mongol invaders, possibly. But unity required coordination. It required trust. It required feuding princes to set aside their differences and act as one. It required time, and time was the one thing the Mongols never afforded their enemies. At Tursk, on February 13th, the Mongols fought their first major engagement on Polish soil. The forces of Lesser Poland, led by a local voivode, met them in the open field. Polish knights in mail, on heavy war horses, charged with all the courage and valor that celebrated their culture, and they rode straight into the oldest trick in Mongol tactics. The Mongol vanguard, light cavalry armed with composite bows, turned and fled. To the Polish knights, raised on tales of glorious charges and cavalry victories, this looked like success. The enemy was running. Pursue them, break their ranks, win glory. And they gave chase, leaving their infantry far behind, breaking their own formations in pursuit of what they thought was a broken enemy. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. The feigned retreat was the bedrock of Mongol warfare, a tactic they had used to destroy armies from China to Persia. The retreating Mongol cavalry lured the Polish knights into an ambush, where fresh troops struck from the flanks, where their horses were exhausted and their formations broken, where the weight of their armor became a burden rather than an advantage, and the Battle of Tursk was a slaughter. The voivode had died on the field, and with him died Poland's first and best chance to halt the invasion. 5 days later, at Siedlnik, it happened again. Another Polish force, this time including troops from Krakow and Sandomierz, met the Mongols in battle. Another feigned retreat, another devastating ambush, another slaughter. The pattern was now clear, but to know the trap and to avoid it were two different things. The Mongols were simply better at it than anyone the Poles had ever faced. And then came March 24th, when the Mongols reached Krakow itself. Here's what you need to understand about medieval Krakow. This was no backwater town. It was one of Central Europe's great cities, a center of trade and culture, home to thousands, yet defended by walls, towers, and all the defensive engineering medieval ingenuity could provide. The Mongols looked at it, looked at their schedule, looked at their orders to keep moving and tie down Polish forces, and made a calculated decision. They didn't even attempt to besiege it, they simply burned it. The population fled. The Duke fled. The city stood largely empty, and the Mongols put it to the torch. Poland's largest city was engulfed in flames, and the Mongol army didn't even slow down. They had more important business, because at this moment, Duke Henry II of Silesia was assembling the largest army that Poland could muster. Henry was one of the most powerful nobles in a fractured Poland, ruling Silesia and bearing the title of High Duke. He understood the threat. He understood that if the Mongols were not stopped, they would sweep across Poland, then continue their path into Bohemia, Germany, and beyond. So he gathered all the forces he could, his own Silesian troops, soldiers from Greater Poland, knights from the military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, sent by the Pope himself, foreign volunteers, Bavarian miners, anyone willing to fight. And he made a fateful decision. He left Wrocław, the largest fortress in Silesia, perhaps his most important city, undefended, simply handing it over to the Mongols without a fight. Why? Because Henry was in a race against time, and he knew it. His son-in-law, Wenceslas I, King of Bohemia, was heading his way with a large army. If Henry could unite with the Czechs, they would have the force to stand against the Mongols. All he needed to do was delay the Mongols long enough for the Czechs to arrive. The Mongols, of course, knew this too. Their intelligence network was superb. They knew precisely where Wenceslas was, how long it would take him to reach Henry's position, and they knew they had to prevent that junction. So, they turned away from Wrocław, abandoning their own siege, and hurried to intercept Henry's army before the Czechs arrived. The two armies met near the town of Legnica, in a place the Germans called Wallstatt, the battlefield. And what happened there on April 9th, 1241, would echo through Polish history for centuries. The April dawn over the Legnica plain was cold and clear, which must have seemed almost a mockery. After the chaos of the past months, after burning cities and desperate retreats, Henry II finally had his chance. He had assembled 25,000 to 30,000 men. This was the largest force that a fractured Poland had fielded in a generation. He had knights from 3 separate military orders, men who had sworn oaths to fight the enemies of Christendom. He had his own battle-hardened Silesians, troops from Greater Poland, cavalry from Opole, and even those Bavarian miners who had traveled this far to stand against the Mongol onslaught. The Mongol force facing him was smaller. Contemporary estimates place its numbers at between 8,000 and 10,000 cavalry, possibly depleted by past losses at Khmelnyk and Tursk. On paper, Henry had a numerical advantage. On paper, this should have been a moment of Polish triumph. On paper, the combined might of Christian Europe should have been enough to stop what were essentially raiders who had been campaigning for months. But on paper means nothing when you face Mongol generals who had spent their lives honing the art of war. Henry divided his forces into 4 main divisions, a standard medieval formation. The Bavarian miners, under the command of Boleslaw of Moravia, formed one wing. The fresh troops from Greater Poland, led by Sulislaw, brother of the fallen Palatine of Krakow, formed another. The army of Opole, under Mieszko, took the 3rd position, and Henry himself commanded the 4th division, composed of his elite Silesians, Moravians, and knights from the military orders, the flower of Christian cavalry, men who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat, ready to charge under the banner of the cross. The Mongol army arrayed itself with the deceptive simplicity that characterized their tactics. The light cavalry of the Mangudai formed the vanguard. These were the skirmishers, the pursuers, the horse archers capable of shooting with devastating accuracy from their composite bows on horseback. Behind them, unseen by the European troops, waited the heavier Mongol cavalry and the commanders who had orchestrated victories from the Pacific to the Baltic. The battle began with a charge from the Silesian cavalry, Henry's finest mounted troops, who thundered forward to engage the Mongol vanguard. This was what they had trained for. This was what their entire military culture celebrated. The charge, the impact, the melee. And for a moment, it must have seemed to work. The light Mongol cavalry retreated before the charge. They scattered, they fled, and every experienced Mongol warrior on that field knew precisely what was happening, because they had done it hundreds of times before. The Silesian cavalry pursued? Of course, they pursued. Victory seemed close, and everything in their training, everything in their culture told them that a fleeing enemy must be caught and destroyed. Behind them, the cavalry from Greater Poland and Opole, seeing what appeared to be success, joined the attack. Thousands of heavy cavalrymen, the best warriors of the 3 kingdoms, thundered across the field in pursuit of light cavalry that seemed to melt before them. And that is when it happened. That is when the trap sprang shut. From the flanks, fresh Mongol troops descended like hammers. The light cavalry, positioned exactly where they needed to be, encircled the pursuing Europeans. And then, smoke appeared. Whether it was an innovative smokescreen or ordinary battle dust, contemporary authors describe a dark pall descending upon the battlefield. obscuring Mongol maneuvers and sowing panic among the European forces who, separated from their infantry and caught up in the chase, found themselves squeezed from two sides. The Polish cavalry suddenly found themselves in a grim nightmare. The Mongols, maneuvering, attacking, retreating again, and attacking again, loosed arrows from their bows from horseback with an accuracy honed by years in the saddle. The Europeans, trained for a single, shattering charge, found themselves in a chaotic melee where their strengths meant nothing and their weaknesses became fatal. The battle devolved into a bloodbath. Some chronicles indicated that 30,000 European soldiers died on that field. This is undoubtedly an exaggeration. However, even conservative estimates number the losses in the thousands. The flower of Polish nobility, the knights of the military orders, the volunteers who had come to defend the Christian world, all fell in a battle that lasted only a few hours. Duke Henry II, realizing the battle was lost, attempted to flee the battlefield with 3 of his bodyguards. He didn't get far. Mongol cavalry caught up with him, and on the blood-soaked grass of Wallstatt, they killed him and severed his head. Then, to break any remaining will to resist, they impaled his head on a spear and displayed it before the walls of Legnica. The man who was meant to save Poland had become a spoil of war. His wife, Anna, would later identify his body by a distinctive mark. Henry had 6 toes on his left foot. It's an intimate detail that makes the story heartbreaking. A woman searching through heaps of corpses, stripped of their armor and dignity, for her husband counting toes. Let me be clear. This is where my bias shows. I have read many books on medieval military history, and the Battle of Legnica enrages me like few other battles. Not at the Mongols, who were brilliant tacticians executing a brilliant strategy, but at the stubborn refusal of European military culture to change. The Mongols had used the feigned retreat for centuries. They had destroyed armies from China to Hungary with this very tactic. And yet, Polish knights, so confident in their training, their valor, and their heavy armor, chased a retreating enemy with the tactical sophistication of a bull charging a matador. Courage does not substitute for brains, and valor is useless when you charge headlong into an obvious trap. If this also angers you, if you find yourself wondering how all of this could have been avoided if only the Europeans had simply learned from their enemies, instead of dismissing them as barbarians, let me know in the comments, because we will see this pattern repeat itself many times yet, and I want to know if you are as frustrated as I am, watching supposedly brilliant military minds make the same mistakes over and over again. The immediate aftermath of Legnica was chaos. The King of Bohemia, Wenceslaus, who had been on his way to link up with Henry, arrived a day late and found the Polish army annihilated. He retreated into Bohemia, though his troops managed to repel a Mongol reconnaissance invasion near Kłodzko. The Mongols, having completed their mission of neutralizing any potential aid to Hungary, divided into raiding parties. They devastated Moravia, terrorized Silesia, and pushed into Lusatia. Small bands scoured the countryside, taking whatever they wanted, burning what they could not carry, leaving a trail of destruction that would take generations to rebuild. And 2 days after Legnica, on April 11th, another blow fell. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, Subutai and Batu Khan annihilated the Hungarian Royal Army, killing between 1/4 and half of Hungary's population in the ensuing campaign. In a week, the 2 most powerful kingdoms of Eastern Europe were shattered. The road to Western Europe lay open, and then something completely unexpected happened. In December 1241, far away in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, Ögedei Khan died. He was the great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, and his death meant that all the princes of the blood had to return home for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would elect his successor. Batu Khan, who had already been planning to push west towards the Atlantic Ocean, was forced to abandon his conquests and return thousands of miles across the steppe. Europe was saved by a death in Mongolia, not by military prowess, not by superior defense, not by some brilliant strategic counterstroke, but by sheer luck. The Mongols withdrew, and Western Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But for Poland, there was no relief. Legnica was a catastrophe on every level. The death of Henry II set back the unification of Poland for decades. The fragmentation that had initially made Poland vulnerable now became entrenched. As rival heirs vied for the scraps of his domain, Silesia, under Henry's control, fell entirely out of the Polish sphere of influence and eventually became part of the Bohemian crown. Cities like Sutek were never rebuilt. The psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical. Poland had learned what the Mongol Empire was capable of. It had experienced firsthand what it meant to be in the path of the most powerful military machine the medieval world had ever seen. The Poles realized that courage, heavy cavalry, and Christian faith were not enough in the face of an enemy simply superior in the art of war. The question was, would they learn the right lessons? Would they adapt, or would they simply hope the nightmare would never return? The reality is, in the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire did not forget, it did not forgive, and it certainly did not cease its expansion simply because one Khan had died. The empire continued, under new leadership and with new ambitions, and Poland, situated right on its border, right in the path of the wealthy Western kingdoms, remained a target. 18 years. That was the time Poland had before the Mongols returned. 18 years to rebuild, to fortify, to prepare. 18 years to learn from the catastrophe of 1241 and build something that could stop the next invasion. Most of that time was wasted. So, 1259. And if you were a Polish peasant who survived the first invasion, you'd spent the last 18 years trying to forget. You'd rebuilt your village, you'd resown your fields, or you'd raised children who had never seen riders with their curved bows and ruthless efficiency. Perhaps you'd even come to believe it was a one-off disaster, a divine punishment that had passed, a nightmare that would not return. You would be wrong. In 1259, the Golden Horde, the western part of the Mongol Empire, now ruled by Khan Berka, decided it was time to remind Poland, who controlled the eastern steppe. This was not the large-scale, coordinated invasion of 1241. This was something almost more insulting. A raid. 2 tumans, around 20,000 riders under the command of Nogai Khan and General Burundai, stormed into Poland, with orders to punish, to plunder, and to remind the Poles that disobedience had consequences. They had another motive, too. The Mongols claimed dominion over the Cumans, a Turkic people who had fled west as their subjects. Many Cumans had settled in Hungary and Poland, and the Mongols wanted them back. Or at least, that was the pretext. The reality was simpler. The Golden Horde needed wealth. It needed to keep its warriors battle-ready, and Poland was a convenient target. Lublin fell again. Sieradz was plundered. Sandomierz, which had surrendered in 1241 hoping for mercy, was razed. Zawichost was devastated. Kowal, painstakingly rebuilt over 18 years, was destroyed again. Bytom burned. The second invasion swept through Poland like a scythe through summer wheat, and the Poles were as helpless as they had been the first time. But here's what's interesting, and it's the first hint of the changes to come. This time, some fortifications held. A few. Not enough to stop the raid, but some stone castles the Mongols simply bypassed because they lacked the time or the equipment for prolonged sieges. The Mongols were now raiders, not conquerors. They wanted quick strikes, easy loot, and rapid withdrawal. Anything requiring a siege was not worth their time. Pope Alexander IV attempted to organize a crusade against the Tatars, as the Europeans called the Mongols, to no avail. No one wanted to fight an invincible empire, especially one that had just demonstrated again that it could strike at the heart of Europe whenever it pleased. Meanwhile, in Hungary, something more interesting was happening. King Bela IV, who had miraculously survived the disaster at Mohi, had spent the last 18 years on an obsessive building program. Hundreds of stone castles had sprung up across Hungary, transforming the kingdom from a land of wooden fortifications into a network of stone strongholds. Bela understood what many of his contemporaries did not. The Mongols could destroy armies in the field, but siege warfare was not their strength. A kingdom that could retreat behind stone walls, that could force the Mongols into slow, attritional sieges, could actually survive. Poland, fragmented and poor, could not match Hungary's building program. Some fortifications were upgraded. Some cities received stone walls, but the systematic transformation that Hungary underwent simply did not happen. Poland remained vulnerable, and everyone knew it. Another 27 years passed. A generation grew up hearing tales of the 2 invasions, stories that likely grew more terrifying with each retelling, of riders who drank blood, of warriors who could shoot arrows backward at a full gallop. Armies moved faster than news could travel. Some of the tales were obvious fabrications, but much of it was true. In those 27 years, Poland transformed, not instantaneously, not dramatically, but gradually, brick by brick, From the ashes of 1,241 and 1,259, a new state was reborn. The central figure of this rebirth was a man who probably never intended to be a hero, and certainly never expected to save his kingdom from the Mongol Empire. His name was Legec II, and in history, he is known by the nickname Legec the Black, perhaps because of his dark hair, or perhaps because of his grim disposition. He became the High Duke of Poland in 1279, taking the reins of a fractured state where the title of High Duke held less sway than it should have. Legec was not a warrior king like the legendary Boleslaw the Brave. He was a politician, a survivor of difficult circumstances, a man who understood that strength lay in unity and preparation, not in glorious but reckless charges. And in 1282, just 3 years into his reign, that understanding was severely tested when the nobility rebelled. The intricacies of medieval Polish politics are complex and, frankly, rather tedious. But the following events are crucial. In 1285, Legec faced a serious rebellion, led by powerful nobles, including Otto of Piljica, the voivode of Sandomierz. The rebels actually expelled Legec from Poland. He had to flee to Hungary, that very Hungary that had been transformed into a fortress state, and beg for assistance. On May 3, 1285, at the Battle of Płock, Legec returned with Hungarian support and crushed the rebellion. This was a decisive victory, one that not only defeated his enemies but utterly destroyed them. From this point forward, Legec's reign became more stable, more centralized, and capable of real action. And what did he do? First and foremost, fortifications. Lots of fortifications. Wawel Castle, twice burned by the Mongols, was entirely rebuilt in stone, not in wood that could burn, not in earth that could crumble, but in stone capable of withstanding fire and siege engines. The castle was equipped with catapults and ballistae, weapons capable of returning fire on attackers. Sandomierz received similar upgrades. Tursk was reinforced. Even the monastery of Wysa Góra in the Świętokrzyski Mountains, a monastery that would normally be defenseless against raiders, was transformed into a defensive position. And this was not the grand building program that Hungary had undertaken, but it was something. For the first time since the beginning of the Mongol invasions, Poland was preparing, not hoping, not praying, but actually preparing for the inevitable return of the Eastern threat. Now, I want to pause and talk about what I believe is key to understanding what made the third invasion different. The first 2 times the Mongols came to Poland, they faced a reactive kingdom. React to the invasion when it happened. React to the army when it arrived. React to the siege when it began. Everything was reactive, defensive, in the worst sense of the word. What Legec was doing, slowly and without fanfare, was transforming Poland into a proactive state, building defenses before the army arrived, planning strategy before the siege began, thinking about how to fight the next war, not the last one. This simple change, however, separates the victim from the survivor. It's the difference between hoping for luck and creating your own luck. And in 1287, as Nogai Khan began to assemble his forces for a third invasion of Poland, this change was going to mean everything. If you enjoy this story of transformation, a story of a ruined kingdom slowly building strength to face an empire, be sure to subscribe, because what follows next is the payoff for all this preparation. And I promise you, it is worth it. November 1287, Nogai Khan, one of the most powerful commanders in the Golden Horde, sent a message to the princes of Ruses, the Mongol vassals who controlled the lands between the steppe and Poland. The message was simple: gather your armies and march with me against Poland. This was not a request. It was an order from a man capable of destroying anyone who refused. The Galician Volhynian Chronicle describes what Nogai assembled as a massive army, 30,000 cavalry, a huge force by the standards of medieval warfare. This was not a raid, like in 1259. This was a serious military operation, intended to punish Poland for perceived offenses and to prevent Prince Leszek from interfering in Hungarian and Ruses politics. The plan was complex. 2 columns would invade simultaneously. The northern column, 20,000 men, including Romanian vassals, under the command of Talabuga Khan, would march toward Sandomierz in northern Lesser Poland. The southern column, 10,000 cavalry of pure Mongol and Turkic warriors, under Nogai himself, would head towards Krakow and the region around Stary Sonks. The two forces would plunder their respective areas, then meet north of Krakow before proceeding on a planned route that would devastate central Poland. They then planned to return to Rus's. Their horses would be laden with plunder, and their reputation solidified. It was a great plan, one that had proven effective twice before, and it treated Poland more like a victim than a worthy opponent. However, for the first time in almost half a century, Poland was prepared to disprove these notions. On December 7, 1287, Khan Talabuga led his 20,000-strong cavalry from his camp near Vladimir, west towards Poland. It was winter, a time when medieval armies traditionally retired to winter quarters, awaiting spring. But the Mongols had always understood that surprise attack was a key element of successful strategy. Winter also meant frozen rivers, which served as natural highways for cavalry. A season that paralyzed European armies made the Mongols faster. However, the Vistula did not freeze. The river, which should have served as an easy route, was still flowing, and Talabuga's army had to search for fords, moving south along the bank. This led to a loss of time and, more importantly, a loss of the element of surprise. This was the first delay, the first hint that this invasion would be different from the previous ones. When the Mongols reached Sandomir's fortress, they expected to see what they had seen twice before: wooden walls that were easy to burn, frightened defenders ready to surrender without a fight, and an easy victory that would set the tone for the entire campaign. However, they were met with stone. The citadel, which had surrendered so quickly in 1241, had been completely rebuilt. This time, it was stone walls, prepared, provisioned, and manned by a determined garrison, with catapults on the walls and crossbowmen on the towers. The Mongols besieged it, and failed. For the first time in 3 invasions of Poland, a large Mongol army could not take a significant fortification. Sandomir's held, and Talabuga's army, which had planned to plunder the city and use it as a base, was forced to lift the siege and continue its campaign without this victory. This event was massive. I cannot overstate its significance. Mongol strategy relied on tempo, speed, and the psychological impact of an unstoppable advance. Every time they failed to take a target, every time they had to bypass a fortress or abandon a siege, their aura of invincibility suffered. And in medieval warfare, morale and reputation were as important as actual combat effectiveness. Talabuga divided his forces. This was standard Mongol tactics. Small detachments were sent out to plunder, gather intelligence, and keep the enemy on edge. A detachment approached the monastery of Wysogura in the Świętokrzyskie Mountains. Another headed towards the town of Tursk, and all of them encountered fortified positions and local forces who sallied out and engaged them in skirmishes. This was Leszek's strategy in action. Do not meet the Mongols in one large field battle where their superior cavalry tactics could annihilate another Polish army, but instead, force them to disperse, force them to attack fortifications, and allow local garrisons to wear them down. The advantage of the Mongols lay in their mobility and tactical flexibility in open terrain. Remove the open terrain, and you remove their advantage. On December 20th, 1287, in the Świętokrzyskie Mountains region, near a place called Wago, something remarkable happened. Prince Leszek II, leading Polish forces, the numbers of which are described by sources as unknown, but substantial, caught up with Talabuga's main column. The Mongols, in search of easier targets, had dispersed their forces too widely, and suddenly found themselves facing a concentrated Polish army on terrain that was unfavorable for cavalry maneuvers. The Battle of Wago was not a large-scale engagement. We have no detailed descriptions of tactics or precise casualty figures. What we do have is the result, and that result is astonishing. The Poles won. This was not a Pyrrhic victory, a temporary setback for the Mongols. This was a genuine, decisive defeat, after which Talabuga's army retreated. Sources describe it as quite serious. Talabuga's detachments fell back to the Kielce region, and then began a full-scale retreat, taking all the plunder they had already gathered, and abandoning the rest of the campaign. By January 1288, they had returned to their winter camp in Lviv, and the northern invasion was over. To reiterate, because this is very important, for the first time in the history of Mongol-Polish conflicts, a Mongol army was defeated in battle and driven out of Poland. And this happened not by happy accident or by the death of a Khan in distant steppes, but by Polish arms, Polish strategy, and Polish resolve. Meanwhile, Leszek did not celebrate. He immediately moved his army south towards Krakow, because he knew that Nogai's southern column was still active, and Krakow was their target. Nogai crossed the Polish border on December 24th, Christmas Eve, with 10,000 Mongol and Turkish horsemen. This time, there were no auxiliary Rus's units. This was pure Mongol strength, the kind that had terrified Europe for 2 generations, and their target was the same city they had already burned twice before, Krakow. The city that met them was no longer the city of 1,241 or 1,259. Its walls were now stone, massive and high. The once thin wooden and earth citadel had become an impregnable fortress, capable of withstanding any assault from medieval siege engines. The garrison was fully prepared for defense and armed with its own siege weapons, catapults, large and small ballistae, and an arsenal specifically designed for defensive combat. Nogai's forces launched an assault, but they were repulsed, and with heavy losses. Contemporary accounts specifically note that in their attack on Krakow, the Mongols lost several of their commanders. These were seasoned warlords who had been through countless campaigns, and they fell attempting to capture a city that should have been an easy prize for them. Nogai, faced with an impregnable fortress he could not take quickly, and knowing of Talabuga's defeat, made a tactical decision. He broke his army into smaller detachments and resorted to what the Mongols did best, raiding. If he could not take Krakow, he would devastate its surroundings. His troops fanned out across the regions north and south of the city, burning villages, engaging in minor skirmishes with local detachments that sallied out from towns and castles. 2 other detachments under Nogai moved south, into the mountains. One besieged Podolianyek, which they eventually took after skirmishes with local militias, albeit at the cost of significant losses. Another besieged Stary-Sonks, a well-fortified town in the foothills, which was precisely preparing for such an eventuality. Stary-Sonks was, in many ways, the perfect example of how Poland had changed. The town was provisioned. The walls were strong. The garrison consisted of local knights and armed peasants who knew they were fighting for their homes. The siege lasted a month, but the Mongols gained nothing. Every day spent at those walls was a day they were not plundering, not gathering loot, which depleted their supplies and their horses. Meanwhile, Leszek was enacting the boldest part of his strategy. Leaving his troops to defend Krakow, he and his wife and a small retinue of servants secretly left Poland and made a desperate dash into Hungary. He was going to do what Henry II had tried to do in 1241, to rally allies, to gain reinforcements, to create a force that could not just defend, but attack. King Ladislaus IV of Hungary understood precisely what Leszek was facing. Just 2 years earlier, in 1285, Laszlo had repelled another Mongol invasion of Hungary. The massive castle-building program initiated by Bela IV was paying off, and Hungary had learned how to effectively fight the Mongols. When Leszek asked for help, Laszlo did not hesitate. He entrusted a Hungarian nobleman named George of Győr to lead an expeditionary force into Poland. George gathered his troops and began his march north from Podolin and Kesmark, picking up Polish detachments along the way. A Hungarian-Polish alliance was forming and heading straight for the Mongol forces besieging Stary-Sonks. The Mongols had no idea of its approach. But before we get to that decisive battle, I must tell you about the Highlanders. Because while great armies maneuvered and nobles strategized, the common people of Poland were fighting their own war. The Gorals are the inhabitants of the highlands, the Podhale, mountaineers living in the foothills of the Carpathians. They are not knights, they are not professional soldiers. They are shepherds, farmers, and artisans who know their mountains as sailors know the sea. And when Mongol detachments invaded their territory, the Gorals took up whatever weapons they had and fought back. According to popular legend, which likely has a kernel of truth, a Mongol detachment encountered local Gorals in the Dunajec River Valley. The Gorals attacked Mongol camps along the Dunajec River and actually drove them out of the region. This was not a grand battle with formations and cavalry charges. This was guerrilla warfare. The Gorals used their knowledge of the terrain to ambush raiders accustomed to fighting on the open steppe. The Mongols, who had conquered armies from China to Hungary, were halted by Polish shepherds who refused to let their homes be burned without a fight. And this says something about how different this third invasion was. It wasn't just about fortifications, strategy, or leadership. It was about Poland, from top to bottom, deciding that Poland would not be a victim. So, in January 1288, The Hungarian-Polish forces of George of Győr approached Stary-Soncs. The Mongol army besieging the town, around 1,000 men, had been there for a month. They were tired, they were frustrated, and they were focused on the walls in front of them, not their rear. George's detachment descended upon them like a thunderclap. The element of surprise was complete. The Mongol force, caught between a garrison sallying out from the town and reinforcements attacking from the rear, was annihilated. Not defeated, not repulsed, but utterly annihilated. Sources leave no doubt about this. The combined Hungarian-Polish forces, catching a Mongol detachment of 1,000 men completely by surprise, destroyed it. The commander was killed, the entire detachment routed. This was the last major engagement of the Third Mongol invasion of Poland, and it was a complete Polish victory. Nogai Khan, having received reports of the rout at Stary-Soncs, knowing of Talabuga's retreat, and seeing Leszek II mobilizing the main Polish forces, which had also been reinforced by Hungarian allies, drew his own conclusions. His forces were dispersed. His opponents were concentrating. His planned junction with Talabuga would not happen. If he stayed, his entire army could be encircled and destroyed. So, at the end of January 1288, Nogai Khan departed Poland. The third invasion was over, and for the first time in history, the Mongols left Poland not as conquerors, not as successful raiders, but as a defeated army. Let's break down what actually happened, because the significance of the third invasion extends far beyond a single successful defense. This was not a fluke. This was not luck. This was the systematic undermining of Mongol strategy by a kingdom that had spent 47 years learning to survive. Let's compare these three invasions. In 1241, Poland lost an estimated 30,000 men at Legnica alone. Krakow was burned. Wrocław was abandoned without a fight. Sandomir surrendered and was still plundered. The Mongols swept through Poland like a scythe through a field, achieving all their objectives and leaving devastation behind them. In 1259, it was more of the same. Lublin, Sieradz, Sandomierz, Krakow. All were plundered. The Poles could not stop them, could barely slow them down. The only reason things weren't worse was that this time, the Mongols were raiders, not conquerors, and they left once they had what they wanted. In 1287-1288, the Mongols failed to take a single major city, or castle. Sandomierz held, Krakow held, Stary-Soncs held. They took a few villages and small towns, sure, but nothing significant. They suffered significant losses in men, including experienced commanders. They suffered a genuine military defeat at Wago and complete annihilation at Stary-Soncs, and then retreated, abandoning their objectives and breaking off the campaign. Historian Stefan Kaunas points to two main reasons for this dramatic turnaround. Firstly, the Mongol leadership was divided. Talabuga and Nogai poorly coordinated their actions, perhaps due to rivalry, perhaps due to strategic disagreements. When Talabuga retreated after his defeat, Nogai was left alone, and a divided invasion force is a weak invasion force. But the second reason, the one that truly matters, the modernized Polish fortifications made settlements far more difficult to take, and this allowed Leszek II and his nobility to implement a three-stage defense plan that was, frankly, genius in its simplicity. The first stage, passive defense by garrisons. Fortified towns and castles held their ground, refused to be intimidated, and forced the Mongols to either besiege them or bypass them. Every bypassed fortress served as a refuge for the local population and a base for future operations. The second stage, sorties by local forces to engage small Mongol detachments. This part is often overlooked. While the main Mongol armies were powerful, small raiding parties were vulnerable. Polish forces from fortified positions could strike these detachments, harass them, inflict casualties, and retreat behind their walls. The death by 1,000 cuts led to the third stage, a counterstroke by a large Polish-Hungarian combined army against the dispersed and weakened Mongols. This is what happened at Stary-Soncs, and this is what would have happened to all of Nogai's forces if he had remained in Poland. Once the Mongols were dispersed, once they were weakened by casualties and minor defeats, they could not stand. It is elegant, it is effective, and it is the complete opposite of the strategy Poland had employed in 1241, when they tried to meet the Mongols in an open field battle and were annihilated. Now, I want to make something clear, because in my opinion, There is a tendency in history to overcorrect and start viewing a defeated country as incompetent. The Mongols were not incompetent. They remained one of the most effective military forces in the world. Their cavalry tactics still outmatched European knights in open-field combat. Their strategic planning was still sophisticated. But warfare is not just about tactics. It is about adaptation. It is about the ability to learn from your mistakes and change your approach. The Mongols were using the same tactics that had worked for 2 generations across 3 continents. Poland changed the rules of the game. They did not try to beat the Mongols at cavalry tactics, because that was a losing proposition. Instead, they created conditions where the Mongol cavalry's advantages were rendered less effective and Mongol strengths were neutralized. Stone walls are indifferent to how good your horse archers are. Feigned retreats do not work behind stone walls. Stone walls simply stand there, forcing you to either bring siege equipment you don't have or retreat. And every day spent trying to figure out how to deal with those walls is a day you are not achieving your objectives. The human element also matters. Legnica does not get enough credit for this victory. He was not a legendary warrior. He did not lead glorious cavalry charges. He was a politician and an administrator who understood that preparation and strategy trumped bravery and improvisation. He built fortifications. He organized defenses. He undertook a risky diplomatic journey to Hungary to secure allies. He coordinated a 3-stage defensive plan across a still divided kingdom. And let's give credit to the people of Poland. From the knights holding the walls of Krakow to the Highlanders ambushing Mongol raiders in the mountains. The difference between 1,241 and 1,287 was not just about fortifications. It was about the will to resist, the resolve to fight, the refusal to simply accept the inevitability of the Mongols. This is what strikes me, and this is where I get a little emotional about this story. Poland in 1287 was not a great power. It had been devastated twice. It was fractured. It was poor. It had every reason to simply accept that the Mongols were invincible and try to accommodate them, pay tribute, do whatever it took to avoid another invasion. Instead, they fought, they prepared, they adapted. And when the Mongols returned expecting another easy victory, Poland stood firm and sent them home defeated. This matters. In a world where it often seems that the strong always win, where resistance seems futile, and the sensible solution is simply to accept one's fate, Poland's victory in 1287 is a reminder that the outcome is not predetermined. Preparation, resolve, and strategic thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. I am not claiming that victory comes easily, or that the weak always triumph. That is not true, and it is disingenuous to pretend it is. What I am saying is that the weak have a chance, if they are smart, if they learn, if they adapt. Poland proved that. And now, let's talk about what happened next. The Mongol Empire would endure for another century and a half. However, its westward expansion phase ended after its failures in Poland and Hungary in the 1280s. The empire fragmented into separate Ulises, whose rulers were more concerned with infighting than with conquering Europe. The Golden Horde retained influence in Eastern Europe, but its power waned, and by the 15th century, it had disappeared. Poland, meanwhile, gradually unified, taking another generation. But in 1320, Władysław Łokietek was crowned king of a reunited Poland. The kingdom, fragmented and vulnerable in 1241, had become one of late medieval Europe's leading powers, eventually forming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. None of this was preordained. Had Poland fallen in 1287, had the Mongols prevailed in their third invasion, the entire course of European history could have been altered. Poland's sheer persistence, its ability to learn from its defeats and build a defensive system strong enough to repel them, changed the historical trajectory. And this brings me to the final important point I want to emphasize. History is not a chronicle of inevitable forces and predetermined outcomes. It is a narrative of choices. Poland made the choice to build stone fortresses. Legnica made the decision to travel to Hungary for help. The garrison of Sandomierz chose defiance. The Gorals chose resistance. Each of these choices mattered. The Mongols chose to apply the same tactics that had brought them success before. Talabuga and Nogai failed to coordinate their actions effectively. Individual Mongol commanders chose to storm Krakow rather than bypass it. These choices, too, were significant. Ultimately, one set of choices led to victory, the other to defeat. This is how history works. Not through inevitability, but through the aggregation of thousands of individual decisions, some great, some minor, but all of them important. So, when you look at your own life, at your own challenges, remember Poland in 1287. Remember that defeat does not have to be final. Remember that you can learn, you can adapt, and you can change the terms of engagement. Remember that stone walls and resolve can stop armies that seem invincible. And if this story has touched you, if it has changed your perspective on resilience, strategy, or the nature of victory, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, because I have more stories like this. Stories about historical moments that reveal deeper truths about how the world works. Leave a comment and share what you believe was the most important factor in Poland's victory, because I am genuinely curious to hear what resonated with you. Share this video with someone who needs a story about overcoming incredible odds, because in a world that often seems dominated by forces too powerful to fight, we all need reminders that resistance is not futile, that learning from defeat is possible, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the underdog wins. Poland faced the Mongol Empire 3 times. Twice, it fell. Once, it stood, and that one time was enough to change history. The horsemen of the apocalypse invaded Poland expecting another easy victory. They were met by stone walls, determined defenders, and a kingdom that had learned from its mistakes. They found a Poland that no longer wanted to be a victim, and they never returned. That is the power of resilience. That is the power of learning from failure. That is the power of refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. Poland in 1287 proved that the impossible is merely difficult, something no one has yet figured out how to do. They found a way, stone by stone, strategy by strategy, battle by battle. They built victory on the ruins of 2 previous defeats, and if they could do it, facing the greatest military machine of the medieval world with limited resources and a fractured kingdom, then what is your excuse? Build your walls, learn from your defeats, change the rules of the game. Based on this story, please adapt the story into English, without altering the core content, in standard, complete, and grammatically correct English, without omitting any content, with a length equivalent to the original, covering everything, without summarizing,